So it's been a couple of days since my episode of Dr. Phil aired, and I've read and heard plenty of reactions to my appearance and to the discussion that we had on the show. And many of these reactions have been quite angry. But the one thing I have not heard from the angry side, from my critics, is any sort of counter argument.
One of the annoying things about hearing him say this is that my two most recent videos already provided counter arguments to some of his perspectives before the episode ever released. So to recap, in previous videos, I relayed what mainstream neuroscience has to say about transgender brains and how they relate to their gender identities. And it turned out that transgender identities correspond to their brain sex. If I understand correctly, I think Matt already realizes there are identifiable differences between male and female brains. What he doesn't seem to realize is that a person with a female brain can be born with male genitalia.
What happens in the little developing male fetus who doesn't produce enough testosterone? And this does happen. If those little gonads don't produce enough testosterone, so there isn't enough to get into the brain and thereby be converted within certain groups of neurons into estradiol, that male will develop a female brain.
And I was kind of surprised that I didn't see Dr. Phil mention this because he definitely has in the past.
I had a conversation with your mother before you came out, and she said, you know, what is this that my son thinks he wants to be a woman? And I said, well, you know, interestingly, there's a very serious study by the Cleveland Clinic that has done MRI scans on transgender persons that has determined that the brain of a transgender person is much more similar in function and profile if you are a transgender woman, that your brain is much more aligned functionally with a straight female than it is with a male.
So Matt's perspective that trans people are just delusional is actually demonstrably wrong. A trans or non-binary person is technically part male, part female.
So you think it's a delusion? Someone is self-delusional?
Yeah, I think it's delusion.
To further demystify this for you, if necessary, biological sex can be broken down into components, including, but not necessarily limited to, genotypic sex, phenotypic sex, and brain sex. Genotypic sex has to do with chromosomes, phenotypic sex includes genitalia and some other stuff, and brain sex, of course, has to do with the brain. Genotype, phenotype, and brain type usually all agree on what an individual's biological sex is, but that's not the case in people who are intersex, trans, or non-binary.
So what happens if we manipulate the hormonal environment of a male or a female rat during their critical period right after birth when their brains are going to become sexually dimorphic? Note that the animals that we manipulate, we can determine what their genotypic and obviously phenotypic sex are. So let's imagine that we take a female rat pup and we give them testosterone during the critical period. Now, these animals are females genotypically and phenotypically. If we manipulate by giving testosterone during that critical period and never give testosterone again, as adults, those females engage in mounting behavior. They act as males, not as females. If we take little male pups and we castrate them during the critical period. Now remember, it's the critical period that's important, not if you do anything any other time, but that critical period. If you castrate little male pups during their critical period, as adults, they show lordosis when they're approached by males, and they also engage in nesting building or nesting behavior. So they act consistent with their brain sex.
Rather than issues of gay versus straight, what is the neurobiology of transsexuality? And that used to be considered to be purely a domain of psychopathology. If being gay used to be a certifiable psychiatric disorder up until the early 1970s, the American Psychiatric Association, in their textbook, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, you could be psychiatrically certified as ill. A psychiatric disorder was being homosexual or lesbian. And then in what had to have been one of the more all-time blowout committee meetings ever, they decided that no, actually it's not a psychiatric disorder, and overnight about 40 million Americans were cured of a psychiatric disease. The notion of transsexuality as a psychiatric disorder has had much, much longer shelf life. What's the neurobiology of that? To date, there have been a handful of studies, and they show essentially the same thing. Really, really interesting. Another region of the brain that shows a sex difference in its average size. Don't even worry about the name of this. It's called the bed nucleus of the striae terminalis. It's where the amygdala begins to send its projection into the hypothalamus. Another one to those gender differences. There's one type of neuron in there with a certain type of neurotransmitter where very, very reliably it is about twice the size in males than in females. Sufficiently so that even in human brains you could pretty confidently determine the sex of somebody by seeing the number of these neurons. You'll see I'm not even saying the name of the neurotransmitter. It's irrelevant. It's just another one of those differences, a dimorphism in a region of the brain, a really, really reliable one. And this was a study done by some superb neuroanatomists looking at transsexuals. And what they showed was very interesting, which was very, very reliably and a very powerful effect what you would see in their large sample size of transsexuals' brains post-mortem was people would have this part of the brain the size not of their sex that they were born with, but rather of the sex they insisted they always actually were. Wow. Immediate questions one must ask. Okay, well maybe this is due to the fact that when people change gender, transsexual procedures, there's a whole lot of hormones involved, and maybe that's doing something to this part of the brain. Critical control that they had was this was looking both at transsexuals who had made gender changes and those who went to their deathbed saying, this is not the sex that I am, I got the wrong body, but never made the change. It wasn't a function of having actually gone through the transition and the endocrine manipulations with it. Another control they had, which was looking at men who would get a certain type of testicular cancer where they would have to be treated with certain feminizing hormones. In other words, very similar to some of the endocrine treatments of male to female transgendered individuals, and post-mortem, you didn't see the changes there. It has nothing to do with the hormones. It had to do with the person insisting from day one that they got the wrong body. And this was a landmark study, fabulously well done and controlled, and replicated once since then, showing that what transsexualism used to be thought of is that people who think that they're a different gender than they actually are. What this study suggests is what transsexualism is about is people who got the wrong gendered body. And these are people who are chromosomally of one sex. In terms of their gonads, they're of that sex. In terms of their hormones, they're of that sex. In terms of their genitalia and their secondary sexual characteristics, they are of that sex. But they are insisting that's not who I really am. This part of the brain agrees with them.
They're all quite sure that I'm wrong, and not just wrong, but hateful and vile and evil and dangerous. And yet none of them, I mean, not a single one, has been able to explain why. They especially are unable or unwilling to answer the question that has provoked much of this outrage, which of course is, what is a woman?
Before you posted this video, Samantha Lux tweeted this.
Woman, noun, the gender typically associated with the female sex. There you go, transphobes. That's it.
This, of course, is not too different from Matt's definition, or my own. And it works just fine for both cisgendered women and trans women whose gender identity correspond to their female brain sex.
Well, this is one of the problems with this left-wing gender ideology, is that no one who espouses it can even tell you what these words mean.
Well,
can you tell me what a woman is?
No, I can't. Because it's not for me to say. Womanhood looks different for everybody.
It's not the answer I'd give, but it's a perfectly valid point. Spoken language is subject to interpretation, and certain words have come to mean different things to different people. Sometimes a dictionary definition suffices, other times it seems to leave a lot unsaid.
You stood up here and said trans women are women.
Yes.
Tell me what you mean. What is a woman?
Womanhood is something that, just as Ethan explained, I cannot define because I am not
But
myself.
you used the word, so what did you mean when you said trans women are women if you don't know what it means?
Right? So here's the thing. So I do not define what a woman is because I do not identify as a woman. Womanhood is something that is an umbrella term. It includes people
That
who...
describes what?
People who identify as a woman.
Identify as what?
As a woman.
What is that?
Was to each their own. Each woman, each man, each person is going to have a different relation with their own gender identity and define it differently.
That doesn't,
and so
I'm not
trans
asking for
women
that.
are women too.
I don't know why Matt is having such a hard time understanding Addison's point. The point is that while Addison doesn't feel in position to define someone else's identity, if someone cognitively identifies as a woman, then clearly such an individual defines the term in a way consistent with their identity.
The article claims that my job, quote, depends on generating media attention for my anti-LGBTQ antics. And that is true, I admit. I actually have a little, behind the scenes, behind the curtain thing here. I have a certain number of anti-LGBTQ antics that I have to engage in each week contractually. It's written in the contract. And then on Fridays, I have a meeting with the bosses where they review my anti-LGBTQ antics catalog to see if I met my quota. Now, fortunately, if I fall short, some weeks I do, I can make up for that by oppressing some other marginalized group. And this is how it works in conservative media. The left's suspicions are totally accurate.
Guess we can't expect him to admit that he's wrong.
So I've noticed an interesting phenomenon online. Everybody keeps saying, let's go Brandon.
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 And so now it has become a sensation on media. I see it in our comment section. I see it in everybody's comment section. Let's go Brandon. And I was like, what is going on with this? I was like, who is Brandon? What's happening?
I wonder if Brandon's going to run for president.
Brandon is the embodiment of the new American dream, where everything's free. That means he's an incredibly good person, far better than you are.